The Mafia boss threw the black Maid out of the mansion. Her eyes promised revenge. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. Sarah Johnson had always been a woman of quiet strength, working tirelessly in the mansion of Michael Hunter, a notorious mafia boss. But today was different. Today, Sarah stood at the foot of the grand staircase, her hands trembling with anger, her eyes locked onto Michael's cold gaze. The air was thick with tension. Michael had just ordered her out of the mansion with a single, cutting gesture. He had humiliated her in front of the entire staff, and now, he expected her to bow down and leave without a word. But Sarah wasn't going anywhere. She had learned the harsh realities of life in the mansion, the secrets that Michael tried so desperately to keep buried. And today, she wasn't just going to walk away like she had done so many times before. Sarah stood tall, her back straight, and with a calm voice, she spoke. You may think you've won, Michael, but you have no idea what's coming. Those words hung in the air, a promise, a warning. Michael, unfazed by her words, chuckled and motioned for the guards to escort her out. But as Sarah was led to the door, she didn't look back. Her eyes, filled with silent rage, promised something far more dangerous than Michael could ever imagine. She wasn't just any maid. She wasn't just a woman trying to survive. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she had a plan. The door slammed behind her, but Sarah didn't flinch. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air on her face, and for the first time in years, she felt free. The world outside was different. She could feel the weight of her past lifting, and she knew that she was about to change everything. Michael Hunter, the mafia boss who thought he controlled everything, was about to face the consequences of his actions. And Sarah, the woman he had thrown away, was about to make him regret it. The following days felt like a blur for Sarah Johnson. As she walked away from the mansion, she didn't look back. The weight of the years she had spent serving Michael Hunter, a man whose power and wealth had made him believe he could do whatever he wanted, had been lifted from her shoulders. But her heart, heavy with both rage and determination, knew that this was only the beginning. The plan she had been carefully crafting in her mind for years was now in motion. Sarah wasn't going to let Michael's words define her. She had endured the insults, the slights, and the unfair treatment for far too long. Now, it was time to use what she had learned to her advantage. Sarah had a plan, and it was going to bring Michael Hunter to his knees. As she settled into a small, modest apartment, far from the luxury and opulence of the mansion she had once cleaned, she began making calls. The network she had quietly built over the years, the connections she had kept hidden, were all starting to pay off. She wasn't just any maid. She had been observing, learning, and listening. She knew the ins and outs of the Hunter family business. She knew the financial schemes, the shady dealings, and the secrets that could destroy Michael's empire. It was time to act. Sarah's first step was to meet with a man named Vincent, a former associate of Michael's who had fallen out of favor. Vincent had spent years working for the mafia boss, handling some of his more unsavory business deals. But when Michael had betrayed him, Vincent had left, vowing never to return. Sarah knew that Vincent had the information she needed to get started. He had the inside knowledge that could expose Michael's darkest secrets. They met in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where no one would ask questions. Sarah had always preferred these quiet, inconspicuous locations. Vincent, a tall man with graying hair and a hard expression, looked up when she entered. He didn't speak right away, his eyes scanning the room, ensuring no one was paying attention. Once he was satisfied, he gestured for her to sit. You're sure about this? Vincent asked, his voice low. Michael Hunter is not a man you want to cross. Sarah nodded, her eyes unwavering. I've been waiting for this moment my entire life. Vincent raised an eyebrow, his gaze assessing her. You've got guts. I'll give you that. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping even further. Michael's got enemies, but he's also got secrets. Secrets that can destroy him. You know what I'm talking about, right? Sarah leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. I know exactly what I'm talking about. The conversation that followed was a carefully planned exchange of information. Vincent gave Sarah the details she needed: bank accounts, contacts, and evidence that could be used to expose Michael's illegal activities. Sarah listened intently, her mind racing as she connected the dots. This was the moment she had been waiting for. As she left the diner, she felt the weight of her decision settle in. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for the people like her, the ones who had been crushed by Michael's greed and arrogance. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's plan took shape. She met with other key figures from Michael's past, people who had been wronged, betrayed, and left in the shadows. She gathered the pieces of evidence she needed, carefully building her case. And as she did, she watched Michael closely. Every move he made, every word he spoke, was now being scrutinized. It wasn't long before Sarah realized that Michael had underestimated her. He thought she was just a maid, someone who would be forgotten as soon as she left. But Sarah wasn't someone who could be easily erased. She had strength, intelligence, and a fierce determination to see things through. As the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, Sarah knew it was time to make her move. She had everything she needed to destroy Michael Hunter. Now, it was just a matter of timing. The mansion, once a place of torment for her, would soon be the place where Michael's empire would come crumbling down. Sarah was ready. She had the power now. Michael Hunter had no idea what was coming for him. Sarah's plan was now in motion, and every step she took felt like the calm before the storm. The pieces had fallen into place, and she was getting closer to the endgame. Michael Hunter, the Mafia boss who thought he could control everything, had no idea that the very woman he had discarded was about to bring his world crashing down. It had been 2 weeks since Sarah had met with Vincent, and things were progressing as planned. The evidence she had gathered was damning. She had enough to expose Michael for his illegal activities, but there was one thing left to do. She needed to make sure Michael never saw it coming. Sarah had been keeping her distance from the mansion, carefully watching from afar. She knew that she had to wait for the perfect moment, the moment when Michael would be at his most vulnerable. As the days passed, Sarah continued to build her case, working late into the night, piecing together the information she had collected. The mansion, once a symbol of Michael's power, had become a prison for Sarah. But now, it was her weapon. Every secret she uncovered, every dark corner she exposed, brought her closer to victory. Sarah had spent years in the shadows, cleaning up after Michael and his family, but now it was her time to step into the light. She was ready. One evening, Sarah received a phone call from Vincent. His voice was low, cautious. "The time is almost here. You've got everything you need. All we need is one final push." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. "I'm ready," she replied, her voice steady. "Let's do this." The plan was set in motion. Sarah knew exactly what needed to be done. She had spent weeks studying Michael's schedule, learning his habits, and finding the right people to help her. With Vincent's help, she had managed to secure access to the mansion's security systems. She could now monitor every move Michael made, and that was the key to her success. Sarah knew she had to be careful. Michael had eyes everywhere, and one wrong move could lead to disaster. But she was determined, and her resolve was unshakable. The night of the operation arrived, and Sarah was ready. She had made all the necessary arrangements. The team she had assembled was in place, and the plan was set. The mansion was quiet, as it always was late at night, but Sarah knew that the calm before the storm was always the most dangerous. As she watched from the shadows, she could see Michael through the windows of his study. He was sitting at his desk, unaware of the danger approaching. Sarah smiled to herself. This was it. She was finally going to take him down. The plan was simple. She would expose Michael for the criminal he was, but she had to do it in a way that left him no room to recover. The world would know the truth, and Michael's empire would crumble. Sarah's heart raced as she made her way to the mansion's back entrance. She had practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times, and now it was finally happening. As she stepped inside, she felt a sense of power wash over her. This was her moment. She was no longer the maid who had been thrown out of the mansion. She was the one in control now. Sarah moved quickly, her footsteps silent as she navigated the halls of the mansion. She had memorized every detail, every hallway, every room. The house that had once been a prison now felt like a labyrinth full of opportunities. She reached the security room, where she would disable the cameras and gain access to the system. It was the final step before she could make her move. As she worked, She heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. She froze, holding her breath. Michael's voice echoed down the hallway. "Is everything ready?" he asked, his tone cold and commanding. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had to act fast. With one final click, she gained access to the security system. The cameras went dark, and Michael was blind. This was it. Sarah was in control. She moved quickly, making her way to the study where Michael was still sitting. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was the moment she had waited for. As she entered the room, Michael looked up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence. Then Sarah spoke, her voice steady and firm. "It's over, Michael. Your empire is crumbling, and you won't be able to stop it." Michael's face turned pale as he stood up from his desk. His eyes darted around the room, but he couldn't find a way out. Sarah had him cornered. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice trembling. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Sarah smiled. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm messing with. And you've underestimated me." The truth was out. Michael Hunter, the Mafia boss who had once been untouchable, was now at the mercy of the woman he had thrown away. Sarah had won. The silence in the room was deafening as Michael stood frozen, his world crumbling in front of him. Sarah's words hung in the air like a weight, and for the first time, Michael understood the depth of his mistake. The woman he had dismissed, the one he had humiliated, was the one who held all the power now. Her eyes, once filled with fear and uncertainty, were now sharp with resolve. Sarah was no longer the maid who served his every whim. She had become a force to be reckoned with, and Michael had no idea how to fight back. As Sarah stood there, watching Michael with unwavering confidence, she could feel the years of pent-up frustration, anger, and betrayal finally beginning to dissipate. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had been the one pushed aside, the one who had to endure, but now, she was in control. She had the evidence. She had the knowledge. She had the power. Michael, on the other hand, had nothing. The empire he had built with lies and manipulation was falling apart, and all he could do was watch. "You're finished, Michael," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "Everything you've built is a house of cards, and it's coming down." Michael's eyes darted around the room, his mind racing, trying to find a way out. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the rules. But now, he was the one trapped. "You think you can just walk in here and destroy everything I've worked for?" Michael's voice cracked, his arrogance fading into desperation. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Sarah stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," she said, "and I'm not afraid anymore." Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then he realized he had no power left. Sarah had taken it all. She had outsmarted him, outlasted him, and now, she was going to make sure he paid for everything he had done. Sarah knew that she had to be careful. Michael still had people on his side, people who would stop at nothing to protect him. But she had a plan. She had everything in place. And now, it was time to set the final stage. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. She held it out to Michael, who looked at it with confusion. "What's this?" he asked, his voice still trembling. "This is the end for you," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "This envelope contains everything you've been hiding. The accounts, the illegal deals, the money laundering, it's all here. And I'm going to make sure the world knows." Michael's face drained of color as he realized the gravity of what she was holding. "You can't do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll ruin everything." Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling in. She had spent years being silent, being invisible, but now, she was taking back what was hers. "I'm not ruining anything, Michael," she said softly. "I'm just exposing the truth." With that, Sarah turned and walked out of the room, leaving Michael to face the consequences of his actions. She had done it. She had finally taken control of her own life, and in doing so, she had brought down the man who thought he could destroy her. As Sarah stepped out into the night, she felt a sense of freedom she had never known before. She had won, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and preparation for Sarah. The decision was made, and now she just had to wait for the world to catch up with her. The envelope she had left with Michael had set everything in motion, and now, her every move was being carefully calculated. She had everything she needed to bring down the empire that Michael had built, but there was one thing she had to be sure of. She had to remain one step ahead. Her phone buzzed in the middle of the night, a message from Vincent. "It's happening. Get ready." The urgency in his words told Sarah everything she needed to know. Michael had no idea what he was about to face. The power that had once seemed so unshakable was crumbling, piece by piece, and Sarah was at the center of it all. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The silence in her small apartment was calming, and for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to relax. It was a fleeting moment, one that lasted only a few minutes, but it was enough to remind her that she was no longer the woman who had been thrown out of the mansion. She was the one in control now. The following morning, Sarah received another call, this time from an anonymous source. The voice on the other end was smooth, calm, and professional. "The first step has been taken. The documents are being distributed as we speak. Michael Hunter won't be able to hide anymore." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The world was finally going to see Michael for who he really was. The man who had built his wealth on lies, betrayal, and the suffering of others. "Good," she replied, her voice steady. "Make sure the media knows about it. Every last detail." After hanging up, Sarah walked over to the window and looked down at the busy street below. People were going about their day, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. She knew that once the truth came out, everything would change. Michael would be exposed, and the world would see him for the criminal he was. But even as she thought about the consequences of her actions, she felt no fear. She was ready. The phone rang again, this time with a familiar voice, Vincent's. "It's done," he said, his tone grim but satisfied. "The papers have been sent. The authorities are already looking into it. Michael doesn't have a leg to stand on." Sarah smiled to herself. She had done it. The Mafia boss who had once thought he could control her, who had thrown her out like garbage, was now a man on the run. Michael's empire was about to come crashing down, and Sarah would be the one to make sure he never regained his power. As the news began to spread, Sarah watched from the sidelines, knowing that she had played her part. The media was abuzz with the revelation of Michael's criminal activities, money laundering, illegal dealings, and the countless lives he had destroyed to get where he was. The story made headlines everywhere, and for once, Sarah didn't feel the need to hide. She had taken back her power. Sarah had become a symbol of justice for all the people Michael had trampled on. It was a sweet victory, but it wasn't the end. There was still work to be done. As the investigation into Michael's activities continued, Sarah knew that she had to stay vigilant. She had made sure that Michael's secrets were exposed, but now, she had to make sure that justice was served. She was no longer just a victim of the system. She was a force that the system could no longer ignore. The world had finally seen Michael Hunter for what he truly was. But for Sarah, the fight was far from over. She wasn't just going to sit back and watch as the pieces fell into place. She had made it this far, and she wasn't about to stop now. With the pieces of her past finally in the open, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The truth was out, and the people who had wronged her would finally be held accountable. She was ready to take on whatever came next, knowing that she had the strength, the intelligence, and the determination to face anything. The end of one chapter was only the beginning of another, and Sarah was prepared to write her own story from here on out. Days passed, and the world was beginning to feel the ripple effects of Sarah's actions. The media had latched onto the story with fervor, and Michael Hunter, the once untouchable Mafia boss, was now a man under investigation, his empire crumbling with every passing hour. Sarah had kept her distance, watching everything unfold from the sidelines, but now the weight of her actions was settling in. She had brought Michael to his knees, but the question on her mind was what came next. The power she had fought for was now in her hands, but it wasn't the same power Michael had wielded. This was different. It was earned, not taken by force or fear. Sarah didn't want to be the person who used her newfound influence to harm others. She had spent too long as a pawn in someone else's game, and now she was determined to make sure that no one else would have to suffer the way she had. Her phone rang. It was Vincent again. "The authorities are moving in on Hunter's associates," he said, his voice clipped. "They're all scrambling, but it's only a matter of time before they're caught." Sarah listened carefully, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Good. Keep me updated." "Will do." Vincent replied, before hanging up. Sarah stared out the window, lost in thought. The game had changed. Michael was going to fall, and she was going to be the one to make sure that his legacy of corruption didn't continue. But there were still loose ends to tie up. Sarah knew she couldn't walk away just yet. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her victory wasn't just about taking down Michael. It was about rebuilding the lives of those he had destroyed. People like her, people who had been trampled under his weight. They needed justice too. Sarah wasn't just going to walk away from this. She had a new purpose now, one that went beyond revenge. The world had seen what Michael was capable of, and now it was time to fix what he had broken. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and strategizing. Sarah met with lawyers, investigators, and people who had once worked for Michael. Everyone was eager to help, eager to bring him down. But Sarah knew this had to be done carefully. One wrong move, and everything she had worked for could unravel. Sarah's focus had shifted. No longer was she simply out for revenge. She was now looking at the bigger picture. She wanted to make sure that the people who had been hurt by Michael's actions had a chance to heal. She wanted to create a new future, one where the power wasn't in the hands of the corrupt, but in the hands of those who truly deserved it. She reached out to the families who had been affected by Michael's schemes. One by one, she met with them, listening to their stories, hearing their pain. Some were skeptical, unsure if Sarah was truly on their side. But as she spoke to them, as she shared her own story, they began to trust her. They saw that she wasn't like Michael. She wasn't interested in power for power's sake. She was interested in justice. Slowly, Sarah began to build a network of people who were all united in a common goal, to ensure that the wrongs Michael had committed were righted, and that those who had suffered would be given a chance to rebuild their lives. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but Sarah was determined. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. Meanwhile, Michael's world continued to unravel. The authorities closed in on him, his assets were frozen, and his associates were scrambling to cover their tracks. Sarah had done her part. She had exposed the truth, and now, it was up to the world to deliver the justice. But Sarah didn't just want Michael to face the consequences of his actions. She wanted to make sure that his downfall created a ripple effect. She wanted to make sure that the system that had allowed men like him to thrive would be changed, and that no one would ever be able to take advantage of others the way Michael had. Sarah knew that it was going to take time, that it was going to be a fight, but she was ready. She had the strength now, the strength she had found within herself when she least expected it. As the investigation into Michael's associates deepened, Sarah continued to move forward with her own plans. She wasn't just going to leave it to the authorities. She was going to make sure that everyone involved in Michael's crimes paid for what they had done. And she wasn't going to stop until every last one of them was held accountable. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly free. She had fought back. She had taken control of her own destiny. And now, she was in a position to help others. The past few years had been full of pain and struggle, but they had also shown Sarah the power of perseverance, the importance of never giving up, and the strength that comes from standing up for what is right. Sarah wasn't just the maid who had been thrown out of the mansion. She was a woman who had found her voice, and she was determined to make sure that voice was heard. The investigation into Michael Hunter and his criminal empire continued to gain momentum. Sarah watched with quiet satisfaction as the once powerful Mafia boss's world seemed to crumble around him. Every move he made now felt desperate, as if he could sense the walls closing in. But to Sarah, this was more than just about taking him down. It was about making sure that people like Michael would never again have the power to destroy others with their greed and cruelty. It had been weeks since the truth about Michael's illegal activities had surfaced, and now, as the authorities closed in, it was time for Sarah to take the next step in her plan. She had spent countless hours working with lawyers, victims of Michael's actions, and other people who had been wronged by him. Together, they were building a case so strong that there would be no way for Michael to escape the consequences. But Sarah knew that she had to be cautious. Michael had always been one step ahead of his enemies, and she couldn't afford to make a mistake. With the legal battle intensifying, Sarah began to focus on the people Michael had left behind, those who had worked for him, those who had been under his control, and those who had suffered in silence. She met with them one by one, listening to their stories, offering them a sense of hope that had been absent for so long. Sarah's own past was woven into theirs. She understood the fear, the uncertainty, and the feeling of being trapped by someone with too much power. She had once been one of them, but now, she was in a position to help. As Sarah continued to build alliances, she also made sure to stay ahead of the game. She knew that Michael wouldn't give up without a fight. He had too much to lose, and his pride would never allow him to bow down without a struggle. But Sarah was ready. She had learned from the best. She had watched Michael's every move, seen how he manipulated people, and understood the intricacies of his operations. Now, it was her turn to turn the tables. With the support of those she had brought together, Sarah prepared to take the final step in her mission. The plan was simple, but it would require precision and timing. She had to ensure that Michael's empire would not rise again, that the people who had been hurt would finally get the justice they deserved. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about ensuring that the system Michael had used to exploit others would be dismantled, piece by piece. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than expected. Sarah had been following Michael's movements closely, and she knew he was preparing to make a final push to escape the consequences of his actions. His last-ditch efforts to cover his tracks were becoming more frantic, and Sarah knew this was the moment to act. She coordinated with law enforcement, making sure everything was in place. It wasn't just about taking Michael down. It was about ensuring that his associates, his network of corruption, would also be held accountable. As the authorities moved in, Sarah stood by, watching as Michael's mansion was surrounded by police cars. She didn't feel a sense of satisfaction in his downfall. Instead, she felt a sense of closure, knowing that the nightmare Michael had created for so many people was finally coming to an end. Michael was arrested that day, his empire collapsing beneath the weight of the truth. His associates were rounded up, and the evidence Sarah had helped gather became the cornerstone of the case against him. It was over. Sarah's eyes followed the police cars as they pulled away from the mansion, taking Michael with them. She didn't feel anger or happiness. She felt something more profound, peace. It was a peace that had eluded her for so long, and it was the peace that came from knowing that justice had been served. But even as the case against Michael progressed, Sarah knew her work was not done. She wasn't going to fade into the background. She was determined to make sure that the changes she had fought for would last. The system needed to change, and Sarah was going to be part of that change. She had witnessed the destruction caused by men like Michael, and she wasn't going to let it happen again. Sarah knew that there would always be more battles to fight, more people to help, and more work to be done. But for the first time in years, she felt like she had a purpose beyond survival. She had fought for something bigger than herself, and she had won. As the months passed, Sarah continued to work with the families and victims of Michael's crimes. She helped them rebuild their lives, providing them with the resources and support they needed to move forward. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor, and she was using her experiences to make the world a better place. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, and of struggle, but Sarah had never wavered. She had always known that she was capable of more than she had been allowed to believe. Now, as she stood on the steps of a courthouse, watching the final stages of Michael's trial unfold, Sarah knew that her journey had only just begun. The fight for justice, for truth, and for a better future was ongoing. But Sarah was ready. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. And now, she was ready to light the way for others. Months had passed since Michael Hunter's arrest, and the world was beginning to heal from the chaos he had caused. Sarah had been at the center of the storm, the woman who had brought him down, and now she was faced with a new challenge, the rebuilding. The case against Michael was far from over. The trial was long and complicated, but the evidence Sarah had gathered was undeniable. The courtroom was a place where justice was being served, but Sarah knew there was more work to be done. Her mind was focused, her purpose clear. She had become a symbol of strength for the victims of Michael's actions, and now, she was determined to ensure they all had a future. While the trial continued, Sarah found herself drawn back into the world of law and reform. She had always been observant, learning from the mistakes of the past, but now, she was ready to take action. She knew that the system that allowed men like Michael to thrive still existed, and if she didn't act, others would fall victim to the same cruelty. Sarah had spent too long as a passive observer, waiting for the world to change. But now, she was ready to be a part of that change. She began working with local community leaders and activists to create programs that would help people who had been oppressed by corrupt systems. She worked tirelessly to provide resources for the underserved, for those who had been silenced for far too long. Sarah's role had evolved. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, someone who was determined to make sure that what had happened to her would never happen to anyone else. As the months turned into a year, Sarah's reputation grew. She became a voice for the voiceless, someone who would fight for the underdog, someone who would stand up to power when no one else would. She knew she was making a difference, but there was still so much to do. The healing was only just beginning. Michael's trial had been a public spectacle, but for Sarah, the real work began after the cameras stopped rolling. She spent time with the families who had been affected by Michael's actions, listening to their stories, offering her support. She helped them rebuild their lives, offering legal assistance, financial aid, and most importantly, hope. The work was slow and painstaking, but Sarah knew that it was worth it. She wasn't just undoing the damage Michael had caused. She was creating something better, something more just. It was clear to Sarah that the world had changed. People had begun to see the truth about Michael Hunter, but more importantly, they had begun to see the importance of standing up against corruption, of fighting for what was right. Sarah had become a beacon of hope for so many, a reminder that no matter how long it took, change was possible. As the years went by, Sarah continued her work, traveling across the country, speaking at conferences, and inspiring others to take action. She knew the battle wasn't over, but she also knew that she had started a movement. Michael's empire had fallen, but the impact of his actions would be felt for generations. It wasn't just about taking him down. It was about ensuring that the power he had abused could never be misused again. In the end, Sarah found peace in knowing that she had done everything she could to right the wrongs that had been committed. She had taken back her life, and in doing so, had given others the chance to take back theirs. Sarah had faced the darkest parts of her past, and instead of allowing them to define her, she had used them as the fuel to create a brighter future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt ready to face it. She had found her purpose, and she knew that as long as she had the strength to fight, she would never stop working for a better tomorrow. It had been 2 years since Sarah first exposed Michael Hunter's dark empire to the world. She had witnessed the downfall of a man who had once thought himself untouchable, and yet, as time passed, she realized that the true victory was not in his defeat, but in the lasting change that followed. The world had seen the truth, and now, the ripple effects were reaching far beyond the confines of Michael's criminal network. Sarah's efforts had sparked a movement, one that was slowly, but surely, rewriting the rules of power, justice, and equality. She had become more than just a survivor of Michael's cruelty. She had become a leader, a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. But even as she watched the transformation unfold, Sarah knew her work was far from finished. The fight for justice was ongoing, and she was determined to stay in the trenches until the battle was won. Over the years, Sarah had continued to build bridges with those who had been affected by Michael's actions. She had traveled to different cities, speaking at rallies, meeting with lawmakers, and connecting with activists who shared her vision for a more just society. Her voice was heard, and it was a voice that demanded change. But it wasn't just her words that made an impact. It was the actions that followed. Sarah had worked tirelessly to create programs that provided support for the most vulnerable members of society, the marginalized, the overlooked, the ones who had been ignored by the systems of power. She worked with legal teams, social workers, and community leaders to ensure that the broken systems Michael had exploited would never be able to hurt anyone again. It wasn't easy. Change never came quickly, and it never came without resistance. But Sarah had faced far worse. She had faced the very man who had tried to break her, and she had emerged victorious. She had proven that no matter how powerful someone seemed, no matter how high they stood above others, they could be brought down by the truth. Sarah had learned the importance of persistence. She had learned that no one could change the world overnight, but that didn't mean the world couldn't be changed. One step at a time, one victory at a time. As Sarah stood at the podium, speaking to a crowd of thousands, she could see the faces of those who had been touched by her work. She could see the faces of people who had once been afraid, who had once felt powerless, but who now stood with her, ready to fight for a better future. The crowd was filled with hope, with determination. And Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to do. The fight for justice would never truly end, but as long as there were people like Sarah, people who were willing to stand up, speak out, and make a difference, the world would continue to change. As the applause roared in the background, Sarah took a deep breath. She had come a long way from the scared, invisible woman she had once been. Now, she was a force to be reckoned with. Her journey had not been easy, but it had been worth it. And as she looked out at the sea of faces, she knew that the future was bright. The darkness that had once threatened to consume her had been replaced by the light of truth, and she was ready to keep shining that light for as long as it took. The world had seen the power of one person's determination, and Sarah knew that she would continue to be that person. She had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless. And she wasn't about to stop now. As Sarah stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching the last of the legal proceedings unfold, she realized that the battle for justice was far from over. Michael's downfall had been a significant victory, but it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The systems of power that had allowed men like him to thrive were still in place, and there were still countless others who had been hurt, exploited, and forgotten. Sarah had proven that it was possible to bring about change, but now, she had to ensure that this change would last. She was no longer just the woman who had exposed a criminal empire. She was the woman who had ignited a movement. And with that responsibility came an understanding that the fight was not over, it was evolving. It had been months since Michael's arrest, and Sarah's life had changed in ways she had never imagined. She had become a symbol of hope for those who had been oppressed, a voice for the voiceless, and a reminder that even the most powerful figures could be toppled by the truth. But with the accolades and recognition also came the weight of her decisions. She was now seen as a leader, someone who had the power to make things happen. But leadership was not something Sarah had ever asked for. It had simply been thrust upon her, and now, she had to rise to the challenge. The weight of the responsibility was heavy, but Sarah had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She had spent years working in the shadows, enduring mistreatment, and learning from the very system that had oppressed her. Now, she was using that knowledge to dismantle the system itself. The first step in Sarah's new mission was to focus on education. She knew that lasting change could only come if the next generation understood the importance of justice, fairness, and equality. Sarah partnered with local schools, offering workshops and mentorship programs to young people who had been affected by the same systems that had held her back. She shared her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor, a woman who had fought for her place in a world that had tried to silence her. The workshops were a hit. Sarah's raw, honest approach resonated with the students. They saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, and in turn, Sarah saw a glimpse of the future she had been working toward, a future where young people understood their power and their responsibility to stand up for what was right. But even as Sarah poured her energy into the next generation, she knew that the fight for justice would require more than just education. It would take activism, legislation, and a shift in public consciousness. She began to work with lawmakers, pushing for reforms that would make it harder for corrupt individuals like Michael to exploit the system. She fought for better protections for workers, stricter regulations on corporations, and more accountability for those in power. It was a slow process, and progress was often met with resistance. But Sarah was used to fighting against the odds. She had done it before, and she would do it again. As the years went by, Sarah's reputation continued to grow. She was invited to speak at national conferences, her voice heard on the global stage as a champion of justice and equality. She became a sought-after consultant, advising organizations on how to create more inclusive and equitable systems. But despite her success, Sarah never lost sight of the people who had helped her along the way. She remained in contact with the families who had been affected by Michael's crimes, offering her support and resources whenever they needed it. She had never forgotten what it was like to be powerless, and she wasn't about to let others feel that same way. One day, while sitting in her office, reviewing some case files, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was from an old friend, Vincent. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and concern. "You won't believe what's happened." Sarah listened intently as Vincent explained that Michael's associates, the ones who had managed to evade justice during his trial, were beginning to resurface. They were trying to regain control of the empire Michael had once ruled, and they were using the same tactics they had used before. But this time, things were different. We need to stop them before they get too powerful, Vincent said. Sarah's heart raced. She had hoped that once Michael was gone, the darkness would recede, but she knew better. The system had a way of protecting its own, and those who benefited from it weren't about to let go without a fight. I'm on it, Sarah replied. She had spent years dismantling the system that had enabled people like Michael to thrive, but now, she would have to face the remnants of that system. She couldn't let the progress they had made be undone. Sarah gathered a team of trusted allies, individuals who had stood by her side through thick and thin. Together, they developed a plan to expose Michael's associates and ensure that they would face justice, just like he had. The work was relentless, the stakes high, but Sarah was determined. She had fought too hard to let it all slip away. As the investigation into Michael's associates gained momentum, Sarah found herself once again in the heart of the fight for justice. But this time, she wasn't alone. She had the support of a community that had rallied around her, a movement that had been born from her struggle. And with that support, Sarah knew that nothing could stand in their way. The battle was far from over, but as long as Sarah had breath in her body, she would continue to fight for what was right. Months had passed since Sarah had taken down Michael Hunter's empire, but her fight for justice was far from over. As the investigation into his associates continued, Sarah knew that the system of corruption he had helped build was still lurking in the shadows, ready to re-emerge if given the chance. The remnants of Michael's criminal network were scattered, but the people who had been enabled by his power and influence were not easily defeated. They had learned the ways of manipulation, deceit, and control, and they were ready to rebuild their empire. But Sarah was determined not to let that happen. She had spent so many years being silenced, being overlooked, but now she had a voice that had not only been heard but respected. She had been the catalyst for change, and she wasn't about to stop now. The fight was personal. It wasn't just about bringing down one man. It was about dismantling an entire system that had allowed men like Michael to thrive. It was about ensuring that the people who had been harmed by that system were never forgotten, that they had a chance to rebuild their lives, to move forward. Sarah's days had become a whirlwind of meetings, calls, and strategic planning. She was working closely with law enforcement, helping to track down Michael's associates, providing them with the information they needed to build a case. But she knew that their work would be met with resistance. Michael had built his empire on the idea that money and power could shield him from justice. His associates were just as ruthless as he had been, and they weren't about to give up their positions of privilege without a fight. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of the operation, she found herself growing increasingly focused. She had seen the toll that the pursuit of justice could take, but she had also seen the strength of the people she was fighting for. They had been oppressed, silenced, and ignored, but now they were starting to speak out, starting to demand accountability. It wasn't going to be easy, but Sarah was determined to see it through. Her resolve had never been stronger. One day, as Sarah sat in her office, reviewing the latest developments in the case, she received a call from Vincent. "Sarah, we've got a lead," he said, his voice urgent. "One of Michael's former associates has come forward. They're ready to testify." Sarah's heart raced. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. She knew that if they could get a solid confession, they could bring down the rest of Michael's network for good. "Where are they?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the excitement that surged through her. "They're waiting for you," Vincent replied. "We've arranged a meeting. You need to come now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door, her mind focused on the task at hand. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The meeting was set in a small, inconspicuous cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was a place where no one would ask questions, where people could talk freely without fear of being overheard. As Sarah entered the cafe, she spotted Vincent sitting at a corner table, his eyes scanning the room. When he saw her, he stood up and gestured for her to join him. "It's happening," he said, his voice low. "They're ready to talk." Sarah sat down across from him, her eyes focused on the man who had agreed to testify. He was older, his face lined with years of hard living. He had been a part of Michael's inner circle, and he knew things that could bring down everyone involved in the network. "What made you come forward?" Sarah asked, her tone calm but probing. The man hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I couldn't live with myself anymore," he said, his voice gravelly. "I've done things I'm not proud of, but what Michael and his people did to others, that's not something I can ignore anymore. I can't keep helping them destroy lives. Sarah nodded, understanding. This was why she had fought so hard. To give people like him the courage to stand up. We'll protect you, she assured him. You're doing the right thing. Over the next few hours, the man gave Sarah and Vincent all the information they needed to take down Michael's remaining associates. It was a breakthrough, but Sarah knew that the fight was far from over. The investigation would have to be meticulous, the evidence thorough. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope. This was the moment when everything could change. As Sarah left the cafe, she felt the weight of the world shift ever so slightly. The people who had been silenced for so long were finally being heard, and the people who had taken advantage of their silence were starting to pay the price. The work wasn't finished, but it was close. Sarah had brought down Michael, and now, she was bringing down the rest of the empire he had built. She wasn't doing it for revenge. She was doing it for the people who had been crushed beneath the weight of that empire. The fight was long, but Sarah was more determined than ever. And this time, she had more than just her own strength to rely on. She had the strength of a movement, a force that could not be ignored. As Sarah watched the final pieces of Michael Hunter's empire fall into place, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The wheels she had set in motion had finally begun to turn, and justice was being served. It had been a long, hard journey, and there were moments when Sarah wasn't sure she would make it to the end. But now, standing on the precipice of victory, she realized that the fight was never just about taking down one man. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed men like Michael to thrive and manipulate the lives of those who were powerless to fight back. The months following Michael's arrest had been filled with intense work. Sarah had become a symbol for those seeking justice, for those who had been hurt and exploited. She had become the voice for the voiceless, the one person who had stood up to a powerful man and won. But even as the legal battles against Michael's associates continued, Sarah understood that her mission was far from over. The system had not been completely dismantled. There were still remnants of Michael's influence that needed to be addressed. Sarah knew that while the victory against Michael had been a pivotal moment, it was only one piece of the puzzle. She had to keep pushing forward, to keep exposing the corruption and the greed that still existed in the shadows. Sarah had spent the past year working alongside law enforcement, activists, and community leaders to ensure that the reforms Michael's downfall had sparked would lead to lasting change. She had poured her heart into creating opportunities for those who had been marginalized by the system, for those who had been silenced by fear and oppression. And the more Sarah worked, the more she realized that she was not alone. There were others, people who had been hurt by the same systems, who were now stepping forward, using their voices, their experiences, and their strengths to fight for a better future. Sarah had become a part of something much larger than herself. She had ignited a movement that was gaining momentum every day. The voices of those who had been silenced were now being heard, and together, they were creating a future where power and wealth no longer dictated who had a voice. The change was slow, but Sarah could see it. She could feel it in the air, in the conversations taking place, in the way people were beginning to demand more from their leaders. It was a revolution of sorts, but it wasn't violent. It was a revolution of ideas, of truth, and of the belief that everyone deserved a chance at justice. One afternoon, as Sarah sat in her office, she received a call from one of her colleagues. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with urgency, "you're not going to believe this. Michael's network is still trying to push back. They're trying to regroup, to find new ways to regain their influence." Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped that once Michael and his closest associates had been arrested, the remnants of his empire would dissipate. But it seemed that the corruption ran deeper than she had realized. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, even though a sense of urgency was creeping into her mind. "They're making moves in the shadows," her colleague replied. "We need to act fast if we want to stop them before they can rebuild." Sarah knew that this was the moment when everything could go one of two ways. She could either accept the progress that had been made and hope for the best, or she could keep pushing, keep fighting to ensure that Michael's influence would never return. She wasn't about to stop now. She had come too far, and too many people were counting on her. "Get me the information," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We'll deal with this once and for all." In the weeks that followed, Sarah and her team worked tirelessly to gather information on Michael's associates who were still attempting to rebuild their network. They used everything they had learned from the past and applied it with precision. Sarah was no longer just a former maid who had stumbled into a world of power. She was now a strategist, a leader, someone who knew how to navigate the system and use it to her advantage. The investigation was grueling, but Sarah's resolve never wavered. She knew that this was the final battle. If they could shut down the last remnants of Michael's empire, they could ensure that no one would ever have to suffer the way she had. The final showdown came swiftly. With the evidence they had gathered, Sarah and her team coordinated with law enforcement to take down Michael's associates once and for all. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when it seemed like the pieces might not fall into place. But in the end, the truth prevailed. Michael's associates were arrested, their network dismantled, and the grip of corruption that had held so many people in its clutches was finally broken. Sarah stood outside the courthouse after the final trial, watching as the people who had once controlled everything were led away in handcuffs. It was a moment of triumph, but also one of reflection. Sarah had achieved what she had set out to do. The system that had allowed people like Michael to thrive was being dismantled, and the world was a little bit safer because of it. But Sarah knew that the work was far from over. The fight for justice was ongoing, and as long as there were people who needed help, Sarah would be there, ready to fight for them. She had found her calling, and she was not going to stop until the world was a better place for everyone. Years had passed since Michael Hunter's empire had been dismantled, and Sarah was now a symbol of change, a person who had fought for justice and won. But with every victory, Sarah knew that the battle for a better world was ongoing. As the years had unfolded, she had continued her work. But she had also come to understand something crucial. Change wasn't a one-time event. It was a long-term commitment, a constant process that required more than just passion. It required perseverance, strategy, and a clear vision for the future. Sarah had become a key figure in reforming the systems that had allowed people like Michael to thrive. Her voice was heard in boardrooms, at rallies, and in the halls of Congress. She had become the driving force behind policies that focused on transparency, justice, and equality. But even as Sarah's influence grew, she never forgot the lessons she had learned. She had been part of the system that had once been a source of oppression, and she knew that without constant vigilance, the system could always come back, in different forms, with new faces. The work wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It required Sarah to not only keep pushing forward, but to inspire others to do the same. She traveled across the country, meeting with activists, community leaders, and ordinary people who were all striving for change. It wasn't about fame or recognition for Sarah. It was about ensuring that the people who had been silenced had the opportunity to speak, to be heard, and to be part of the solution. And as she watched the progress unfold, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The world was changing, and she had played a pivotal role in that change. But even as she celebrated the progress, Sarah knew that the work was far from over. There were still people like Michael out there, people who believed they could escape the consequences of their actions, people who thought they could get away with exploiting others. And as long as those people existed, Sarah would continue to fight. One day, as Sarah sat in her office, reviewing some legal documents and preparing for a speech, she received an unexpected call. It was from a former colleague who had worked with Michael Hunter's associates during the investigation. "Sarah," the voice on the other end said, "we've got a new case. It's about a powerful figure, someone who's been operating under the radar for years. This time, though, the scale is even bigger than before." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her heart racing. She knew that the fight for justice would never be over, but hearing those words brought everything back: the urgency, the adrenaline, the determination to do what was right. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, her voice calm but steady. Over the next few weeks, Sarah's team worked tirelessly to gather information on the new figure. They dug into the person's past, their connections, and their operations. Sarah had been through this before, but this time, the stakes were higher. The new figure was even more powerful than Michael had been, and the network they had built was vast, with many influential people connected to it. Sarah knew that if they were going to stop this new threat, they needed to move quickly and strategically. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. As the investigation progressed, Sarah found herself once again in the thick of it, coordinating efforts, gathering allies, and working closely with law enforcement. She had become a master at navigating the complex web of power, corruption, and influence. But Sarah was also keenly aware of something that had become even more apparent in recent years. She wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. There were now countless people, organizations, and movements that were all pushing for the same thing: justice, equality, and transparency. It was a network of people who had learned from the past and were determined to create a future where power didn't define who got to be heard. As Sarah continued to work on this new case, she couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. The patterns were the same, the tactics were the same, but this time, she had something she didn't have before: experience. She knew how to outsmart the system, how to anticipate the moves of those in power, and how to ensure that justice was served. The investigation into the new figure was long and difficult, but in the end, it was successful. The truth came to light, and the person who had been hiding in the shadows was finally exposed. The network they had built began to unravel, and the people who had been complicit in the corruption were held accountable. It wasn't the end, but it was another victory. As Sarah stood in front of a crowd of supporters, giving a speech about the importance of transparency, justice, and the power of collective action, she realized something. The fight had never been just about one person. It had always been about the people who were willing to stand up, to speak out, and to make a difference. Sarah had become a part of a movement, but that movement was far larger than any one person. It was a force for change that had been building for years, and now, it was unstoppable. The road ahead was still long, and there would be more battles to fight. But Sarah knew that as long as she had the strength to fight, she would continue to push for a better future, for herself, for others, and for the generations that would come after her.